Talking about, Jason, a miscarriage of justice, let's talk about a president who has pardoned war criminals that shot little girls, pardoned war criminals that killed defenseless prisoners, and then yesterday, of course, pardoned Wall Street convicts, pardoned politicians who acted in the sleaziest of ways. I mean, this is, I mean, you can, like my old torts professor used to say at University of Florida, you can see this one coming like a freight train out of the mist. This is Donald Trump numbing everybody to the future pardons of his co-conspirators, Roger Stone and Paul Manafort, and maybe even Michael Flynn.
Oh, yeah, Joe. And here's the thing. He's always been this guy. It's not new. You can go back to Joe Arpaio. Joe Arpaio, who was basically racially profiling any brown person in Arizona. And President Trump came in and said, OK, you're perfectly fine with this. And I think you can't stress enough about basically pardoning a war criminal. You look at what Gallagher did. You know, stabbing prisoners with a knife. His own SEAL Team 6 said, this man is crazy. They said he'll kill anything. His fellow soldiers turned him in. And obviously, Donald Trump is smarter than the generals and the soldiers because he pardoned him anyway. So what we're seeing here is what proto-dictators do. What we're seeing here is what autocrats do, where they basically say to the entire public and to fellow politicians, number one, the law is always bent to my will. It's not about what you did. It's not about the laws you break. It's not about the people that you harm. It's about whether or not I think you're important, whether or not you're loyal to me. And if I like you, then I don't care what the law says. So this is the dangerous part. And it's not just the norm breaking, but it makes it difficult for our Justice Department to do their job. Look, I don't think William Barr is a particularly ethical guy. But when he says, look, I can't get people to spend 300 hours putting cases together if they know that you're always going to pardon somebody if it happens to be your friend who gave money to your campaign. These are what we were talking about last fall when we were saying there are other impeachable offenses that this president engages in, and he's doing more of the same, but he's been doing it since he got into office.
And you know, Caddy K, this is a couple of, I guess a week ago, there were some Trumpian websites that put up my quote saying Trump would arrest any journalist if he could get away with it. That was critical of him. And I didn't know if they were putting it up to be critical of me saying it or not, but it is so obvious. I mean, there's this authoritarian streak in him, and don't take me at my words, take him at his own, where he says basically what Louis XIV said, I am the state. When I took over this country, when I took over the military, they didn't even have bullets. I am the chief law enforcer of the United States of America. I can do whatever I want to do. I am the state. It's what authoritarian leaders say. It's what Donald Trump says when he says Article 2 gives me the power to do whatever I want to do. It's what Stephen Miller says when he says the president's authority cannot be challenged. This president has authoritarian instincts like no United States president before him. And it's a little more than frightening, isn't it?
Yeah, and look at the people around the world that he seems to admire, right? Sisi in Egypt, Erdogan in Turkey, Putin in Russia, Xi in China. These are all people who are authoritarian, not just seems to admire them, but sometimes seems to express envy for them, that they have powers unfettered by a free press, unfettered by courts that are independent, that he doesn't seem to have. And this isn't just post-impeachment. This has been a trait of Donald Trump's right from the beginning. Right in the beginning of his presidency, he talked about how he wanted to be more involved in the FBI, how he wanted to be more involved in the Justice Department, but was holding himself back, as if that was some concession that he was making. And the problem that we have learned recently is that democracy is partly laws, but it's also partly norms and traditions. And a president not getting involved in judicial cases is a tradition. It's not a law. It's not written down there that he can't do that. And I think that's the That is the weakness of the system that is being shown up. It works if you have a president who accepts the norms and traditions, but if you have one that doesn't, which a populist tends not to do, because a populist thinks they are right and everyone else is wrong and everyone else is against them, then your traditions look a little more fragile. Well,
and if Trumpian supporters on the Trump right make that argument, they need to go back and if they can say, well, it's his Justice Department, he can do whatever he wants with his Justice Department. That's not what a lot of them were saying back in 1993 when the Clinton administration got together with a Justice Department official to just put together a press release regarding Travelgate. The meltdown and the freak out among Republicans on the right was extraordinary. And you look what this guy is doing, where he's completely knocking down any wall of independence between the Department of Justice and the White House. And now suddenly they're mute. Now suddenly it's okay. Now suddenly, because it's Donald Trump, this failed reality TV host who spent the past 20 years giving political contributions to Elliot Spitzer and to Anthony Weiner and to Charlie Rangel and to Hillary Clinton 8 times. Suddenly, this paragon of conservatism, who's run up the debt higher than anybody in U.S. history, suddenly, Mika, it makes it okay. Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.